Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion arranged by Kearney in association with CNBC Arabia. My name is Mayben Kadra, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. As part of the What's Next dialogue series initiated by Kearney, today's panel will discuss the future of mobility, reimagining how mobility in cities could look like in the future. Mobility is a significant part of people's everyday lives. Hence, the question of how people and goods are transported in the future is highly relevant to all of us. Several questions need to be asked to understand how the mobility landscape of the future will look like and what are the challenges and opportunities ahead. To further discuss this topic and more, I would like to welcome our guests and speakers into CNBC Arabia studios. First, I want to welcome Florian Lernet, Head of Mobility at NEOM. And I would like to welcome as well Helmut Schultz, Partner Transportation, Logistics and Infrastructure at Kearney.
Hello.
And welcome to Gopiraj Vadakepat, former Senior Advisor to the Director General and Chairman of RTA.
Hello.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us. Let me start with you, Gopiraj, and of course, any topic, any discussion topic that happens in these days has to start with the question about COVID-19 and how did it impact this sector, any industry, because it had a huge impact. So how did COVID-19 pandemic affect the mobility sector around the world?
Very interesting question. Let me put it this way. If you look at the mobility, we all thought we are moving forward, but actually during the period of COVID, it has taken a step back. And primarily the reason is because of the social distancing and the non-availability of people to travel on the public transport itself with the social distancing norms being in place. So therefore, people have been using less of public transportation and moving towards using their own private cars, which in a way caused more traffic on the roads, which is not good for the cities. But if you look at it from a different perspective, from a fiscal perspective for the governments, it's a huge drain on the governments because they have been subsidizing for the public transport with less transport people on the commuting facilities that are available. And if you look at it from the new ways of mobility that are happening, you can see people getting into, electric bikes and things like that, which is taking the new trends, I should say, in terms of mobility during the period of COVID.
Yes.
But what's happening is that the cities are not planned to take this new modes of traffic.
That's what I want to discuss exactly, because we're talking about new technologies that are affecting all sectors, including the mobility sector. So we're talking Internet of Things, robo-taxis, we're talking electric vehicles. But is the infrastructure ready for this technological advancement, Helmut?
Well, it depends on what technological advancement you're referring to. If we look at autonomous vehicles or vertical mobility, there's still ways to make in building up the infrastructure. In other areas, it is partially there. Obviously, in the Middle East, there is still some gaps to close. Gopi was referring to micromobility solutions, obviously with dedicated bike lanes and facilities that allow these type of traffic solutions to advance further. It would be more favorable.
It will be also having a great sustainability impact, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I think with COVID, we saw two very interesting trends at the same time. And one, of course, was that we realized we could work from home. We could work in a much more distributed fashion. And in some ways, that has the potential to reduce quite significantly the kind of commuting that we traditionally have. People used to work 9 to 5 and drive to the office. And that's what was causing a lot of the issues in terms of transportation in cities. So I think that is a fundamental change that will endure. And it's going to be very interesting to see and how that plays out. I think the other effect that we saw was very much also a return to active mobility, to healthy mobility. If you look at a number of cities in Europe, they actually used the opportunity to close off roads for cars to allow people to walk and to cycle. And so in the cities like Berlin or Paris or Holland, there was a great resurgence and building on existing strong cycling culture. So I think there were several trends there. I think if we zoom out a little bit, you have some fundamental transformations going on, and they're really around three key things. And one is, of course, the need to look at new propulsion, at fuel substitution, at looking at reducing emissions. The other big trend that we're seeing is around how we use mobility. Does it really make sense to have 70 kilos of a human being sitting in a 3-ton vehicle and taking up all the space in the cities? And so I think there's a move towards shared mobility, towards micro-mobility, new ways of consuming mobility. And then thirdly, there is the opportunity to look at different ways to automate transport. And these are all not always linearly connected, but they all open up new opportunity spaces for new forms of mobility.
This is great. I will get back to this point, but Helmut was just mentioning that the infrastructure, especially in the Middle East, is not ready. And one reason why is because in this region, it's really popular to have a car, to own a car. And a lot of factors have encouraged this trend. Do you think that this is about to change?
I think the governments here are getting serious about sustainability and the climate emission and the carbon emissions.
Yes.
So therefore, with that in mind, there will be a quantum shift in the thinking of the governments, and with the promises made by the UAE government to be carbon emission free by 2050, which is a challenging goal by itself. It's going to be interesting to see the changes that are going to happen in the landscape itself. And some of the things that I can see as changes that can happen here in the Middle East region is, bringing those autonomous vehicles in place. You can also see, the magnetic levitation vehicles being in use, which is used for metros and trams.
Okay.
And we also seen something happening in Sharjah on those lines. So you can see such developments happening in the Middle East region as well, which will help.
But maybe there's some kind of divergence between different areas in the Middle East and between different countries. It depends on the government's outlook. Let me get back to you, Helmut. And specifically, I want to discuss autonomous vehicles. How far are we until they are mass-produced?
Good. I mean, mass-produced or mass-used? I think the question is, it's a matter. We are not far away. So if you look at where we currently stand, you have RoboCab pilots already happening in the US, in San Francisco. Waymo piloted since February taxi use that is purely driven autonomously with a driver behind the wheel as a backup solution, but that is open now to the public. People can register, and that's happening. So this is in place. The key players, interestingly, are in the US. So by far advanced Waymo, which is Google subsidiary, and Cruise, which is a GM subsidiary. They have, if you look at the mileage that they reported in 2020, both reported more than 550 and respectively 770,000 miles with autonomous vehicles on the roads, with a very limited number of disengagements, so less than 20 cases partially. So that shows us it's not that far off. Obviously, there's still infrastructure to be built up, the data coverage, all that needs to be done. And we can see this in pilots. Also, Florian most probably can tell a bit about what he's seeing there. As soon as you mix it with pedestrians and in let's say, classic mixed-use areas, it becomes difficult. But in, let's say, dedicated areas, dedicated lanes, this is a matter of a few years.
Florian, can different technologies coexist when we talk about these much technologies that are shaping the mobility sector?
Well, I think that one of the problems that we have in the mobility sector is that there's always this focus on technology. And technology is never actually a solution. That is often simply an enabler that can enable certain different solutions, different systems of mobility. And autonomy is a clear case in point. Now, autonomy in itself is not actually a big problem solver. If every car in the world was autonomous, you wouldn't have solved any problems in this world, whether it's emissions or whether it's congestion. So we have to ask ourselves the question, where can autonomy as a technology add value? But we also have to remember that really there are a number of much more important levers than just technology. So for instance, how do we deal with mobility demand? Mobility demand is meant to rise exponentially over the next few decades. If we don't address that and look at the reason for people traveling and look at better planning, better urban planning, mixed-use planning that reduces the need to commute, then I think we will have a problem. And equally, the other issue we need to address is really to look at more shared mobility to build up very high quality public transit, and that's where technology can play a role. If we can make the combination of high quality and high speed public transit in combination with shared mobility more attractive than the private car, then I think we can achieve a better outcomes for mobility, and then we can use technology in a way that helps us become more sustainable.
So there isn't one single technology that could shift the whole sector and add value to the whole sector or to the population. We have to mix technologies together. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And what's also important is it goes to town planning. Yeah, and if you're able to plan your cities very well, it helps in terms of commuting to the nearest public transportation modes that are available, and that will also reduce the number of cars or the vehicles on the road, helps in sustainability, and also bringing about ease of let's say the savings in time in terms of the traffic flow itself, and that's something which it will happen. So therefore, it's important that cities like New York can plan very well in terms of how the city should look like from a transportation perspective, and plan very well ahead, given the fact that they are carving out new. Unlike in the case of the cities which are already developed like Dubai, it could be possible in the new places where still development is taking place, for example, in places near Expo 2020 where it is possible. But if you look at Dubai or things like that, it might be difficult in terms of doing a proper planning of how the future of the transportation should look like.
Of course. Helmut, we discussed sustainability, but now we have to discuss as well cost efficiencies. What kind of impact do you expect on this of this technological advancement in the mobility sector to have on cost efficiencies?
Well, obviously, we talked about autonomous driving. That has an impact, particularly when you look at the large e-hailing services. So their big bet they're placing is that as soon as autonomous driving is fully in place, that they finally crack the nut to become operationally profitable, right? A big portion of their cost structure, approximately more than 40%, is related to the cost of the revenues, and a large portion of that is obviously also the drivers. So if that is not required anymore, that would actually render them immediately profitable from an operational perspective. That's a cost efficiency can be done. But I think, as Florian also pointed out, the autonomous alone doesn't help. It's together with the combination with shared mobility. That's where you really have an effective use, because as you know, the majority of the time, the car typically more than 22 to 23 hours, and the majority of the cases, the car is just standing around. So we've built cities for cars with a lot of parking places, and that's actually not the best use of it. And there's great examples how in the last years cities started to rejuvenate particularly the city centers, trying to avoid pure private car-driven traffic, but by using all these different technologies together to provide a seamless public transit solution where at some point of time you don't necessarily need to go only with your own car.
Florian, what do you think about that? And I want to ask you as well, to what extent do cost efficiencies provide early adopters of some kind of competitive edge?
Absolutely. I mean, I think to build on what Helmut said, that of course cities have always evolved with technologies, and in some sense are the product of our ability to move things and people over space and time. And we've done that traditionally with different forms of energy and different forms of technologies. But of course, what we're now realizing is that the way we've done this to date, of course, there is a big expense on the environment. There is expense on the space that we use in the cities. If you actually incorporate that into the economic analysis, then we can put a lot of these assets to much better use, whether it's the space or whether it's the underutilization of fleets. So I think as we begin to understand the economics of the sustainable city, that does open up a whole different perspective on cost efficiency. But certainly I think that it certainly opens up opportunities. In particular, if you look at micro-mobility, as I mentioned before, the question of why would I need to have a 3-ton vehicle to move a person of 70 kilos, that's also a cost factor. If I can provide micromobility scooters, if I can reduce the size and the volume and the speed of vehicles in cities, I can provide mobility at in a cheaper fashion. So there's various ways that we can go about discovering those cost efficiencies and releasing some of that capital to better and more productive economic use.
I completely agree, Florian. We're going to come back to this discussion. We're just going to go on a quick break, and this panel will continue after this short break. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. Of course, we're having this panel discussion to discuss the future of mobility with this pretty much flooded technological advancement, COVID-19, and all its structural shifts it has caused on this sector. Let me get back to you, Helmut, and ask you the question that everyone is wondering about, and especially here in the Middle East. To what extent do you think that, this trend and, this trend toward owning an electric vehicle, or maybe the technology around smart cities and autonomous vehicles, all of that, to what extent do you think that it will slow down the popularity of owning a car in the Middle East, and specifically in GCC, because as we were talking earlier, it's pretty popular and people are really used to it?
It's pretty popular. People are used to it, but so far in a lot of the cities also didn't have alternatives.
Yes.
Right? So obviously what you need is a very, very competitive alternative. So a really well-established public transit network. And Dubai has shown that very nicely, how you can build up in 15 years a full landscape of public transit system, including metro, tram, buses, water taxis, aside from the usual taxi fleet, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a great example that has generated, I think, more than 600 million trips in the last year. So this is a great example how in a relatively short time span, if you think about the investments you need to do for that infrastructure, you can achieve the target. Will that completely avoid private cars? Not. That is also a question about how are cities here in the Middle East structured, right, from a topographical perspective. So if they are very widespread, obviously that sometimes is difficult then to create that network. Also the fact that fuel prices are very low, and the weather conditions in the summer are not necessarily favorable for let's say, using bikes in the summer, etc. Right? So that plays a role. But the main point is really to provide that alternative so people can use other means.
I want to discuss as well electric cars, Popiraj. And when we talk about electric cars, currently the technology is really, dominated by only one player, one international player. But this won't be the case because a lot of car companies and the auto sector as a whole is shifting to this technology. What are the bases, or what will be the basis of the competition when we talk about manufacturing electric cars?
Very interesting question. You see, if you look at the electric cars that is being manufactured today, without naming it, you only see what you hear.
Yes.
And probably there are more than one which is already happening in the world, and we don't see them in this part of the world. So we also see quite active in terms of partnerships between big OEMs happening in terms of the electric vehicles and also the autonomous vehicles as well. So the future, if you can discount the fact that there's going to be only one company that will be selling the vehicle in the world, but there will be more than one company that will be available. But I would just want to connect back to what
Please go ahead.
He was saying in terms of the ownership of the cars.
Yeah.
I see that the new generation of people will not like to own their cars if they have good transportation and mobility facilities that are happening in the future. Because one, people realize already that owning a car is a burden on them. And the second is that with the technological changes that are happening across every year, which you have also seen in the case of, let's say, the EV that we see today, it's not the same. Every year you see some improvements. So it's become like an iPhone, which you want to keep changing every year. And that can only happen when you don't own one, in the case of an autonomous vehicle or an electric vehicle. And then you're able to make a choice of it. And it's like you use it when you want it and then leave it on the side of the road. So somebody else picks it and makes use of it. So that's going to be the trend in the future. So, sharing the vehicles. Yeah.
Florian, when we talk about electric vehicles, we're just talking that the technology won't be just dominated by only one company. How do you think this trend is affecting the auto sector as a whole? Are they making enough investments to adapt to this shift?
Absolutely. I think what you've seen in the last 12 months is really a sea change in the sort of a takeoff of the electric vehicle market. In some markets now, you're beginning to see EV sales outstripping conventional cars. There's obviously a broad number of OEMs that are producing electric cars now, and I think in particular you see some of the big Americans, some of the big German car makers now really ramping up mass production. And part of that was driven by the fact that they did not see a market and didn't see demand. And I think that that's now picking up, and so I think you will see a massive wave now of new models coming out from a whole range of different suppliers.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting what that will do to the auto industry, because once you remove the traditional combustion engine, really your skill as a manufacturer is only really around the battery and about the chassis.
So competition will be only revolving around the battery.
It will be very much focused around the battery and around the powertrain. And of course, these engines are much less complex. So a whole swath of industrial expertise is not required anymore. And I think that will also mean that eventually the mobility market will change, where it's not necessarily the manufacturing of mobility devices that's going to be the big value add business. It is the orchestration and the integration of mobility services where the real margin will lie. And so I think you'll see increasingly that the production of vehicles becomes more of a utility, and it is the provision of mobility as a service that will be the big new industry playground.
Yeah.
You're agreeing, Helmut?
No, absolutely. I think if you add this both together, that's what you can see in the market, right? OEMs become solution providers. They're not just putting cars into the market to be bought. They basically provide services, car as a service. You have fleet operators, large rental car companies that are offering now already subscription models that for cars on a monthly basis can be canceled every month. And that's the clear trend where we're going towards. That's helping also with regards to the utilization, better. But it's also driving completely new business models.
When we talk about completely new business models, we have to talk as well about what COVID-19 meant to the commerce business. And this, 7 billion people had to shift to online shopping from everything, groceries, everything. I mean, I've seen a website that actually sells cars online. I don't know how can they do that, but they're doing it. To what extent, Gopiraj, do you see that this shift and this, this trending desire that we have seen from populations to move into e-commerce, to what extent do you think that it will accelerate the technology in the mobility sector as well? To what extent do you see them connected?
See, I think the e-commerce as an industry, we have seen growing very fast in the last 1.5 years since the COVID-19. It has also created great opportunities for the e-commerce companies with new startups that coming into the play as well. Having said that, I think there are people who have their own personal preferences and they want to go out and buy themselves. So that's one set of people. But there's also the set of people who like to remain at home and get things ordered online
delivered to
and
their
delivered
doorstep.
to their doorstep. So so the e-commerce as an opportunity will continue to grow with a growing population. And what will also happen is that there will be an importance of connecting that with the mobility as well. Now, what we have seen during the COVID period is that we have seen the taxis being used as an e-commerce delivery platform. I'm not suggesting that the taxi should do that in the future as well. But what will happen is that when we have the autonomous vehicles on the road, you will see that they will do a dual play of not just carrying a passenger, but also delivering e-commerce goods to the doorstep of the people. So there's going to be a shift in terms of how the deliveries are happening and how the the mobility segment is going to play in the e-commerce segment as well.
It looks like the ecosystem for the mobility sector and the ecosystem for e-commerce will actually merge. Is it how I see it?
Well, there are definitely technological questions that play a role. So you see how large-scale companies as Amazon already have drones flying out e-commerce deliveries, right? So that's obviously a mobility topic. So there is chances and new technological innovations, but there's also constraints that really need to be solved. If you think about the amount of additional traffic you were just mentioning that is created by all these additional e-commerce solutions, cities are clogged with transporters. So streamlining the e-commerce delivery, that's a very important task the city is facing. Remember, we had discussed this already 10 years ago in Dubai about how to find more efficient solutions for e-commerce deliveries, because if you have every 5 seconds a different type of delivery van in front of your doorstep just because you want to have just-in-time delivery, that's not really helping the traffic as well. So that's
a challenge
by basically the challenge by itself.
And I think that's another example where perhaps the solution doesn't just lie in technology, but it lies in different organization. And as Helmut mentioned, if you had better coordination, so you didn't have 5 companies delivering 1 parcel to the same street, but 1 van delivering 5 parcels to the same street, that is less to do with technology, but with commercial organization and perhaps real-time auctions and that would allow for that more efficient distribution. And I agree with Helmut, this is a big problem because we've seen huge rises in city traffic, but also in emissions from e-commerce. So we need to solve that, and it also goes back to the town planning issue that we discussed earlier. How do you ensure that there are mixed-use neighborhoods where you can still also just pop out and get yourself your milk or get something, rather than expect everything being driven to you? And I think we'll have to find a balance between these two things.
I want to discuss something about the mentality. You were just mentioning something that is very important, that for some people, they'd rather actually go to the store and pick their things up. They don't want everything delivered to their doorstep. Some people, like maybe me, sometimes, I enjoy the experience. So this mentality, to what extent do you think that it will affect the choices and the preferences of people when it comes to either mobility or e-commerce?
See, I think from an e-commerce perspective, it will depend on the customer expectations and the service deliveries that they are able to fulfill. If you're an unhappy customer, you'll continue to get things through e-commerce. The day you're not happy with something which you got, you're going to change your thinking, and then you want to walk into your shop and pick up yourself. So it gives you a mental gratification and satisfaction for yourself.
That I have chosen the quality
I've chosen the right product
want.
at the right quality and the right price. Yeah, irrespective of the price, whether you paid it high or not, that's a different thing. But then, what we need to understand is that mobility will definitely be inseparable in the future for e-commerce, and it will go together very well. I think what's important to understand is that people also realize that it's not just about going and doing the shopping. We can also get things sitting at home, based on the example that you said, where people can also look at cars being chosen on the online and trying to get them delivered at home, and you have a choice to use it for 24 hours and you can return it back.
And then return it. Actually, they will come and pick it up. You don't have to return anything.
Absolutely.
So everything happens at the doorstep.
You can even get your car refueled at home. I mean,
Yeah,
Dubai is one of the cities where everything can happen. Obviously, that if that's useful, that's a different question. And I mean, if we go further down the road with electric cars, most likely that won't be necessary anymore at some point of time. But everything's possible currently.
But that shift will change towards having power stations being available all across the main locations, because people don't want to get stranded on the road, and then you have another traffic jam because the cars are without power on the road as well.
Yeah, that's another challenge. That's a whole another challenge.
Yeah.
But I think what's really going to be interesting is whether there may also be a kind of a blowback, that now that people have been locked up inside their homes for the last 1.5 years and perhaps have discovered there's something to enjoy about social contact. So I wonder whether there's going to be a bit of a change back to perhaps wanting to go out rather than sitting in the home. And I think it was a gigantic social experiment that is still playing out to see how the world reacts.
Yeah, so I've discovered like 10 things I can do at home and I will still have fun. I didn't know them before, but due to COVID-19, they came out, they showed up. So we're going to go into a quick break. We're going to come back to continue this discussion, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this discussion. So let me get back to talking about the importance of cooperation between the public and private sector when it comes to the mobility sector. So let me start with you, Gopiraj. What do you think about the importance of this cooperation, and what are the challenges that governments might face when it comes to building ties with the private sector?
The relationship between the public and private sector will become more important with this new advent of technologies that are being brought into play. You cannot have the government spend for the infrastructure and also for the public transportation to be spent as well. You need to bring the private player into play, and the only way you can do is to get them involved from the beginning, as soon as you have a product ready to be marketed into the country. One of the things I always think is that as part of the private-public partnership is to bring in, OEMs to participate or let's say set up their bases in this part of the region, and to have test beds so that they can produce the vehicles that are suited to the environment, rather than being produced in USA or in Germany, which are more suited to the European conditions or the US conditions. I know that the AV vehicle that is being planned to be brought in Dubai is being tested in Arizona because it's a desert region. But that's not always the right solution. Okay. You need to have a test bed where you can bring in venture capitalists to bring in and do investments in this part of the world, and also to grow the local industries as well, which will be a great opportunity for the local entrepreneurs in this part of the world. It's
especially the case because the governments currently don't have the expertise when we talk about this technological advancement happening in the mobility sector. So they need the private sector, they need the engineers, they need the minds and the brains of those who have been working on it for the last decades.
I think you need both. I think you need the innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit that comes from the private sector, but often these technologies only then really come into full play if you have the right regulatory environment. So I think you do need both sides of this. And then I think we also need to, we're going to see a blurring of what traditionally was so demarcated between what we call private motorization and public transport. I think we need to come up with a new way of looking at personal public mobility and the co-production of mobility between the private and the public sector. I think you will always need a role of government in mobility, but I think there is a huge opportunity now, as was just mentioned, to actually in this region also cultivate an ecosystem of innovation around mobility. NEOM very much wants to be a global living lab and work with startups and OEMs from around the world to figure out how we put these different technological innovations together into a comprehensive new ecosystem. And so I think we need governments to provide those test beds, to provide those living labs, and to be flexible to allow for these new mobility systems to emerge. But I think it's a great opportunity for the region.
Yeah, please, Helmut, go ahead.
I think it's also a role the public side, in a sense of the typical organizer of public transit can still continue to play that role of an orchestrator. That's a great a role that is very important, but the existence now of a lot of new players in the mobility space from a private sector perspective has shown that this can work very well. You have basically a public transit authority that works together with private party operators that provide new innovative mobility solutions, and that together provides a full landscape of new mobility solutions that addresses the needs of the people. Right? That's really, as you said, greatly a new cooperation, a new co-functioning model that is clearly the way ahead.
How about the regulatory environment? To what extent do you see it, Helmut, that it needs to evolve as fast as the sector it's regulating?
There's different regulatory questions. There's a question around carbon emissions, which is a very urgent one. This is about how can we make electric cars more attractive, be it, for example, through incentives for car sales or for potentially taxes
To
on
build the
fuel, to
mentality
build the
of-
mentality to make that cultural shift happen. Other topics in the regulation space is obviously safety areas. That is a lot when we talk about vertical mobility, a very new field also that will change the environment in our cities in the next decades to come. And here it's about creating that space. That is a completely uncharted territory, right? And you need to think about how can we regulate that city space where people all of a sudden use now flying taxis, right? So there's different areas of regulation required, and that's always going to be a core role of the public side within that overall mobility space.
What do you think about copyright?
Regulatory is a very interesting aspect. I think this is something within this Middle East region. We are probably still going through stages of learning to adapt and improve upon itself, because this is not something which is, you can borrow from the US or Europe and then merge it together and put it over here.
Because the culture is different.
The
So
culture
you
is
need
different. The
regulations
technology
that fit
or-
the culture.
Yeah, the way transportation operates in this part of the world is different as well. It's going to take time, and what's also important is that once a regulatory framework is established, it's also important that it is more or less uniform across the GCC region. So it makes it easier rather than making a country-specific regulatory requirement, which makes it difficult, especially with the new autonomous vehicles or the new forms of mobility that will come up. It'll not create a level play, or the OEMs may not find it interesting to enter into a country if they feel that the regulatory requirements are very harsh to them, and whereas in a neighboring country it's much more easier to manage it. So it's important that we have a uniform regulatory system across the region, which makes it easier for the OEMs also to enter. The other thing I also wanted to touch upon on the private-public partnership was also the private companies needs to be encouraged through incentives, and that's something which you need to look at models in Singapore or in other places of the world as to how they encourage private sectors to come and participate in the public
Transport and mobility sector.
Mobility sector. The more you give leeway to the private sector, it encourages them to come and take risk and invest as well. And if you are trying to control everything through a regulatory model with the private sector, it will not help in the direction of bringing more private sector players into play.
So let's talk about mobile travel applications as well. So where are we going when we talk about these technologies?
Well, I think this is where you see this, the role of government and of cities becomes quite fundamental, because we can have a lot of different innovative mobility services, but how do we ensure that we have an integrated overarching mobility system that is open and easy to access from all users? So you don't want to have 15 different apps. Ideally, you want to have one app that allows you to move through the city, to jump from one mode to the next, and a truly multimodal system. And this is where I think cities around the world are now looking at how can their role evolve to becoming the host and the orchestrator of that integrated system. And that's where integrated digital mobility platforms play a really big, important role. And this is, again, an ambition we have in NEOM to have a fully integrated multimodal mobility platform that allows you as the user to essentially access through a one point on your app, and then be able to book a journey in real time using a variety of different modes, whether it's then a shared shuttle, it is your high-speed transit, or it's an eVTOL, an air taxi that takes you somewhere. And it's trying to, how do we put these different travel chains together in the most convenient way for the user? So building those digital mobility platforms will be absolutely central, and will also be one of the biggest value adds to then ensure that we can organize mobility as a service rather than as owning vehicles. And I think that's why it's absolutely fundamental that we advance this.
Helmut, what are the challenges that you see corporations and the governments facing when we talk about providing mobility as a service, as Florian was just mentioning?
Well, I mean, the first challenge is you need to create such a platform that allows you to have a sufficient participant network in that platform, right? Once you have all these different players involved, then this can work. But this is relatively a lot of work, right? If you look at some of the examples in Europe, where, for example, large railway operators started now developing apps that involve literally all participants across even a country. We talk about 3,000 players that are merged into one app, right? So you can imagine that this is quite some work, but at the end, this is exactly what's required. So both from a user perspective, so it's imagine you don't need to do anything anymore than just having your phone in your pocket, or be it your watch, whatever you use ultimately as a payment device, because everything is tagged to that, and you don't need to even tap anything on your phone. You just go, and this is automatically booked, yeah, irrespectively of which transport mode you use.
Everything is now connected. All industries, all sectors are connected.
Absolutely.
Once you have a phone and you have the internet, so you're connected to the world. Yes,
absolutely. It brings in a different perspective as well. You look at it from a consumer perspective,
yes,
who is carrying a phone, and you are able to track him as to which direction he's going and which. So if you look at it from a public transport perspective, you are able to plan the future of the transportation based on the demands that are emerging from these signals that you're getting. The other thing is that the governments are able to tap on the data and use the data for selling the data and monetizing out of it as well. Yeah. The third is to create that consumer confidence, because the moment you know that you are being tracked, people don't like it, because it's like getting into their personal space and trying to figure out where is this getting navigated as well.
We are seeing this already on a very smaller scale, social media. So imagine it on a bigger scale when we talk about being tracked.
Yeah, but I think the important point there is that this is going to be, first of all, used in an anonymous way, and this is about understanding traffic patterns, right? The data monetization not necessarily means there's data sold on an individual basis, but you basically can have a set of data that you can use in order to predict traffic patterns and so on. So that's where it's becoming really interesting.
To innovate new technologies in the future.
And it helps you to plan future growth of cities, because you know where people move. And I think then the other thing that was mentioned is it allows you to organize in real time, the real-time disposition of fleets, demand-driven disposition of fleets. And I think this is for the consumer then the opportunity, because it means that you can consume mobility at your fingertips, but it also allows the orchestrator, the city, and the mobility service providers to deliver that service in the most efficient way possible, because they can predict where consumers will need a certain vehicle at a certain time.
Yes,
and I think this is where then the full power of a digital mobility platform, and also where then AI and other tools can help us to do that predictive disposition of services.
So to provide products and services that are fitted for certain and customized for certain users and customers, right?
Absolutely.
So this is the main use of this. So when we talk about smart cities, to what extent do you see that the ecosystem of mobility and smart cities have to align together? They have to come up together and evolve together, Helmut.
Well, that's just a continuation of what we just discussed, right? If you talk about smart cities, you typically talk about intelligent traffic systems, steering of traffic, for example. When we talk about traffic lights or also tolls, etc., all that is playing in a larger field together, right? I can direct traffic flows, I can incentivize people. So this is one core topic. So smart mobility is one part of smart cities. Yeah. That's not separable.
So what are the lessons that this region can learn about the future of mobility sector? You know, we have seen maybe more technological advancement and better infrastructure, maybe some countries around the world. But when we talk about the Middle East as in general, what are the lessons that we must know and learn before this new era starts for us?
The key is to understand, where is this population in the country going? Are we going to be attracting more people into the country? And if that's the case, then, we need to look at how the success models are working across other countries. So a good example could be, you could look at Singapore, you could look at Hong Kong, you can look at US, some other cities. You can also look at Sweden and countries like that, where from a mobility perspective, they have done some very successful models which can be replicated here. it's also important for the governments here to understand that, the preferences of the people coming here are different than what they are here today. So if you are attracting new people, you need to understand where this flock of people are coming from so that you are able to retain them here and you are able to provide them with the future preferences to stay over here as well.
Okay. Tell me, Florian, the same question. When we talk about lessons, what are the lessons that the governments in the Middle East have to learn?
Well, I think that there's a really unique opportunity to help in this region to actually lead some of this transformation. I think there is such investment going into transforming cities, into building new cities here. And I think that the world is hungry for new blueprints about how we organize urbanization in the 21st century. And of course, mobility is so interconnected with the built environment, with energy, with digital systems, that I think there's really an opportunity here to bring that all together and to use the energy and the, in particular, also the demographics of this region to help lead the world in building better cities.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank our speakers, Mr. Florian Lenert, Head of Mobility at NEOM, and of course, Mr. Jyotipiraj Kapad, former Senior Advisor to the Director General at Chairman at RTA, and as well, Helmut Scholz, Partner Transportation, Logistics and Infrastructures at Kearney. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I want to thank our audience. So we were discussing the future of mobility, and the future is already here, and it's just a matter of who takes the greatest advantage and who is willing to seize the various opportunities offered by these historical innovations. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.